Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Geey, and I'm a sports lawyer here in London. So, in all of this lockdown, COVID, pandemic time, I started a YouTube course probably a few weeks ago now when I tried to give everyone a little bit of detail about the area of sport that I work in, which is generally football. So there is a course on my YouTube site dedicated to football. And what I realized and what started happening was actually a lot of people started asking questions about my career in sport and football. How did we get there? How did I get there generally? And how I went about doing it. And so what I thought might just be useful for hopefully quite a few people is to do a similar session, but just talk about some of the practical techniques that I have used and I see used throughout the industry. And I think the important thing just to note here is that this isn't just for anyone wanting to be a lawyer. This is more or less anyone that wants to get into any facet of sport, or more or less a career generally, but it's just because I work in sport quite a lot. Might be you want to get into sports media, marketing, law, accounting, broadcasting, comms, PR, whatever else it might be. And the aim of the week is to set out, as I mentioned, some practical tips and examples that have been pretty handy for me. The aim is to speak for about between 10 and 15 minutes, and then answer some of your questions on some of the areas that I'm going to discuss. So just to very briefly tell you about what I'm going to be talking about for the week. Hopefully you'll be able to see it from my social media posting, if it's been on Twitter or LinkedIn or Instagram or other social channels. The idea for today is talking about building relationships, and just two or three practical examples that I have tried to do over the years, starting from scratch, basically, because I think it's very daunting when you think about networking, building relationships, however else it might be, how you actually go about doing it. So I'm just going to try and give you a few easy practical examples that might actually work. And tomorrow, what we're going to hopefully, what I'm going to try and do is then do a slightly different thing, which is talk about visualizing your network and developing relationships. So if today is building relationships, starting relationships, how do you go about visualizing those relationships and developing those networks? And then on Wednesday, what we're going to touch on is then talking about supercharging your knowledge base. So in my mind, always on some of the articles I've written about career development, on one side, it's building and developing relationships. But on the other side, it's actually supercharging your knowledge. It's investing in yourself so that you know more about the topic, the area, the skill set that you actually want to be able to move a career into. And Thursday, I think, is one of the most important topics that I think is underplayed generally in any career, in any industry, in any networking idea generally, which is you've got to develop a process. And that's one of the things that I actually talk about tonight as well. So process. It's all about grinding out day after day, consistently doing the same good, productive things, which in the end, actually, in my mind and in my experience, has helped massively. And on Friday, we're going to try and bring it all together and talk about some of those relationship building points, some of the visualizing relationships and networks, to finding ways to increase your knowledge of particular areas that you might be interested in, how you then incorporate your knowledge base with that relationship building exercise, and then develop really strong, robust processes to keep going day after day, month after month, year after year. And that will hopefully take us to the conclusion of the week. So my idea is to spend the next 10 minutes or so just talking about some of those practical techniques that I've tried to do to more or less develop building relationships in the first place. So very briefly, I'm a sports and football lawyer. But again, I started off back in when I started my law degree, it was a while back now in 1999. And after that, with no links, no connections, no networks, no one that I knew in sport generally. And so what I wanted to try and do is show that it is possible to be able to start from scratch, to be able to build up relationships with people, ultimately to be able to try and then develop your skills, to develop your knowledge, and then ultimately, if sport and sports industry is the right and interesting market to be able to work in, then to hopefully achieve some of those aims, and achieve some of those goals. And what I wanted to actually touch on, which I'm going to mention, I think, in every single talk I give this week, which is if there's probably one thing I give advice on, or lots of stuff I give advice on, but one particular thing that I say to people that want to work in the sports industry generally, regardless of the particular area of sports as it goes. And it's the biggest counterintuitive takeaway that I'm going to try and provide to you is, if you want to get into sport in the long term, into the sports industry, into the sports sector, and work in the sports industry and sports sector, don't worry about getting a job in the short term. And the reason why I say that is that because if, for example, you're doing an undergraduate degree in sports management or an MBA in sports, whatever else it might be, marketing or comms, or again, for example, in my journey in law, I wasn't always a sports lawyer. I always wasn't a football lawyer. And the thing that I think gets a lot of people is they all want to work in sport, but actually there's no problem about not working in sport for a while, because ultimately what you want to try and do in the long term is build your knowledge base, build your skill set in a variety of particular jobs. It may be that you want to be in comms in sport. Maybe you want to be in marketing in sports. Maybe you want to be in social media in sport. There's no problem about working at a particular company that doesn't do sports work but does comms, or it does or it does PR, or it does marketing, or it does law, or it does accounting. What I mean is that what the most important thing, hopefully, you'll try and get out of the week that I'm going to try and explain to you is the most important element is to build your skill set inside of your chosen discipline. And once you build your skill set inside your chosen discipline, and your skills are increasing, your experience is growing, your knowledge of the particular area and discipline is increasing exponentially, what happens then is you become more valuable to the sports industry more generally, because you've got greater industry experience. And I think it's vital that you can try and do those two things at the same time: build those skills inside or outside of sport, whilst also building your knowledge and network inside and outside of sport. And usually, again, is the counterintuitive takeaway is, don't worry about getting into sport in the short term. Worry about investing in yourself to get into sport in the long term. You usually will help doing two particular things. And this is what we'll come up to now, hopefully for the next 5 or 6 minutes, which is you do it by building relationships. We'll talk about that today a bit. And you do it through supercharging your knowledge. And that's the two main key takeaways, hopefully, from this week, which is build relationships. How do you go about doing that? Supercharging your knowledge. And we'll go about doing that again. So again, that key takeaway, because if you can do that consistently over a long period of time, and I'm not concerned about long period of time being a week or a month, I'm saying to dedicate a significant period of time over a long time, generally, that is when that investment will pay off. You have to be able to do consistently build relationships in sport and to increase your knowledge base. And if you can do both over the long haul, that's how you can start developing that opportunity inside of sport. So what I wanted to do was more or less give you at least two practical techniques that I think have been pretty useful for me. And the idea is actually for at least one of the two to try and start doing those straight away. So practical tip number one, which hopefully will come in quite useful pretty quickly, especially we're not in the offices, we're not meeting a lot of people, unfortunately, physically, but what we are doing is consuming a huge amount, I think I am at least, of digital content. Now that might be video, it might be audio, it might be print, or it might be digital, and it might be a blog, or it might be a podcast, or it might be a YouTube clip. The reason why I say it is the first thing that I tried to do, even when I was very, very junior, even before I started working as a lawyer and was still a student, is that I tried to read an awful lot and consume a lot of content in the areas that I enjoyed reading about and consuming content in. So that might be, for example, in football for me. It might also be in cricket or tennis or rugby or athletics or Olympics, whatever it is in particular sports, or across different types of sports. So it might be law and sport, it might be marketing and sport, it might be comms and sport. Because what effectively happens, and we're in this world now where we have our phones, everything is easily accessible. A lot of it is freely accessible. And there's this infinite content. If you want to be able to find particular topics and areas to be able to understand and read more of, it's relatively straightforward to do it. So the reason I say this is the first process point, and that's something that I do pretty consistently, which is find the particular areas of sport that you enjoy consuming content. And I don't mean reading the scores and the latest gossip. I mean the substantive issues, because what happens a lot of the time in my experience is people will come to me and say, I really want to get into the sports industry. And what they will also say is, I've got a real passion for sport, whatever sport it might be. And then I say, well, tell me, what's the interesting topics that are impacting on the football industry right now? And sometimes maybe 1 in 5, the person involved might actually have some decent understanding of the particular interesting aspects of that sport. But a lot of the time it's, well, I just enjoy playing it, and I've got a passion for knowing more about it. So the first key takeaway, hopefully, to try and explain, is what you need to do is start consuming content in the particular area that interests you. And it might seem a very straightforward point. That is the straightforward issue, which is consuming the content. The next thing, which is actually a lot harder, is what to do about that consuming content. And if I just take 2 things to do from it, the first is there's lots of people that are writing and putting great content out there. Try and respond to them to build your network, to start relationships. Tell people how much you enjoy their content. Tell people about an article that they wrote that you really enjoyed and why you enjoyed it. Start interacting with people across the digital landscape and measure and record all of the different interactions you start having. Now, I know this is a very process-driven idea, but it's a very, very, very important one. You've got to put yourself out there in order to start having conversations off the back of building your knowledge in that particular area. And what I would say on types of things that you want to communicate, I would be specific in your communication. Obviously, it depends which medium you're doing. If it's Insta, it's one thing. If it's YouTube like this, it's another. If it's email, it's another. If it's LinkedIn, it's another as well. But ultimately, try and be specific. Try and be complimentary about something that you've read about the person that's written, and show that you've thought about the piece and offer something back. And then start thinking about how to multiply that effect. And the reason why I say that is as follows. So I was just trying to give some thought to this, obviously, beforehand to prepare. I probably read about and consume or have about 10 to 15 pieces of sports content a day. Short articles, long articles, videos, clips, whatever else it might be. So that's around 70 a week. And for my calculations, my poor maths, that's about almost 300 a month. And over 12 months, that's over 3,000 pieces of content per year. So as you can see, hopefully there, one of the first key takeaways is building your knowledge through content management. It's reading, reviewing, understanding, following up over a year. So you do one of 2 things there. Hopefully the first thing is you then start building a great knowledge bank of interesting articles that you've read that can digest and then can be used in conversation. And the second thing then is that you start interacting with the authors of those pieces. Show you know what you're talking about, show that you can offer something interesting, and build relationships. It doesn't need to be face-to-face. Some of the best relationships I developed for a long time were all digital related, were conversations I was having on the phone, of initial conversations that then developed into really good, positive face-to-face relationships. And then what you've got to do is then plan to decide what you want to do with it. How are people then going to respond, if they're going to respond at all? Don't be too down on yourself when people don't respond. In my experience early on, especially even now to an extent, expect 5% hit rate at best. So that's the first point there. And if I can give you guys, one takeaway now, which is quite important to do, is I had a great quote, which is how soon is now. And how soon is now basically means start it tomorrow and track your progress. And that means tell me how you've done tomorrow is the answer. So from tomorrow, start on the process of reading 5 articles in your chosen field, in your specific sector, in your specific area of interest. Note down who wrote the piece, find them online, and say something nice to them about why you like the piece. So that's my first takeaway for something to be done. How soon is now? There's no time like the present just to start that first process, which hopefully will be of value. The second thing I want to just touch on very briefly, because we're almost a quarter past, is also, I know it's not really relevant now because we can't go to conferences and events, unfortunately, apart from maybe virtual conferences and events right now, is when you're going to these events in the future, and hopefully be of value when we come out the other end of what's happening right now in the world, is when you're going to conferences and events, the one thing that is so underrated but so easy to do is to prepare in advance. And that's the one thing I try and do quite a lot, is that preparation in advance to build relationships with people maybe sometimes that you know, or people that you want to meet at these particular conferences as well. It's simple things like, for example, reviewing an attendee list, seeing who you want to meet and why, actually thinking about why you want to meet that person, and then what would you say? So, for example, there are loads of ways of doing it. It might be that you can email people beforehand, knowing who's on the attendee list. It might actually be also that what you can actually find, you might have an app that allows you to communicate with people. Maybe lots of different things. One thing that I quite like doing was actually just looking at maybe the top 5, 10, 15 people that I wanted to actually meet during a couple of days conference. And if I didn't know what they looked like, to literally go onto LinkedIn, print off a picture of them so I could recognize them if I saw them in and around the conference, to be able to have a small conversation with. So, and then also just preparing a very quick pitch, not even necessarily a pitch for a job, a pitch just to start introducing yourself and then building a bit of a relationship. And that's on the conference and event side. And ultimately, then what you can also consider, I know it's the easiest possible thing, especially, again, the flip side of having one of these to a degree is, it's really important to fight your insecurity when you're at networking types of events, just to sit in a corner and ultimately just look on your phone and pretend you're busy, when actually the reason why you're in a conference and networking facility generally is to meet people and make conversation and build business and add value and all of those type of things. So, one of the things that I still do now, which is I just try and keep congregating in the place where most people congregate, if it's for tea or coffees or pastries or whatever else it might be, and then just strike up very, very simple, straightforward conversations. And that might just literally simply be, how's the conference going? What are you up to? And then start listening. Ideally, you want to listen to what the other person's saying rather than speaking too much yourself. And if you can do that and start listening and just have a quick 5-10 minute conversation, swap cards, and then follow up, you multiply that by a few times, and then you start being able to do what we're actually going to talk about tomorrow, which is building relationships, maintaining those relationships, and then mapping out those relationships. So at some point I did a few years ago, I literally had a very big A3 sheet, which wasn't very digital, and started mapping out all of my connections inside and outside of sport. And that's what we're going to do and have a talk about tomorrow. So that is more or less me at just over 15 minutes of conversations, or rather of me talking. What I'm going to do is have a look at some of the questions that people have asked. Thanks for all the questions so far. Feel free just to keep the questions coming, and we've got a little bit of time just to go through. So, Jack, thanks for your question. Is there anything you would suggest doing as doing a training contract as a trainee solicitor in order to maximize chances of qualifying into the sports sector, either at a firm or in-house? So yeah, I mean, this feeds into a general point, Jack, which hopefully I'm try to stress, which is in the short term, don't worry about qualifying into a team that does only sports work, because ultimately, and I'll say this across different sectors as well, what you want to try and do is develop in law, it would be your legal skill set, your drafting, your communication, your knowledge base, etc., in particular areas. And then don't necessarily worry about when qualifying, you have to deliberately and straight away qualify into a sports area. It might be that actually what you need to do, as I did, I spent the best part of 5 or 6 years in an antitrust regulatory team, which I loved and enjoyed so much, in aviation law, in media, in telco, in car automotive parts, in financial services. I was doing tons of different sector work, as well as starting to build up my sports practice as well. So what are the types of areas? I think it's generally commercial contracts, intellectual property, disputes, corporate, regulatory. Ultimately, there's potentially lots of work on the property side of things, in terms of anything that might happen from sports stadia, redevelopment. Ultimately, what I think you've probably got to consider is which area of law do you enjoy the most, and which areas might be more akin to what might work for a lawyer wanting to work in sports. And probably commercial contracts, disputes, intellectual property, corporate transactions, they are the general types of areas that at least I tried to focus on quite a lot in the beginning. So thanks for that, Jack. Teniola. Speaking of increasing knowledge, what are your thoughts on a sports-concentrated MBA for a foreign-trained lawyer looking to break into the sports business in England? I can't really speak from too much experience, only because I haven't done a sports-concentrated MBA, and so I can't really give you too much insight there. The other bit also is, again, what I would say is it's very much more concentrate on where your skill set actually is. If you need to take particular courses in order to become an English qualified lawyer, that's the priority. If you need to understand contract law in a particular country, then that's what you probably need to be doing. And then building up your network, your sports network, in different ways. Ultimately, it's become the best lawyer, become the best marketeer, become the best communications expert you can be, become the best social media analyst, become the best, particular subject area first, and then delve into those particular sectors, use those skill sets into those particular sectors, sport and obviously football being one of those that I've worked with for quite some time now. Michael's next question. So do you think that technology actually helps real networking, or do old school connections last longer? I think technology is a massive help if you can do it in the right way. And I'll give you an example of what I think is the wrong way to network from a digital perspective. I see no value in anybody connecting on me on LinkedIn just for the sake of connecting with me. I still say yes to quite a lot of people, but I don't understand why people find connecting with anybody on LinkedIn useful if they don't use that connection and don't have a reason why they want to connect with me. So I think that's a reason why technology sometimes isn't particularly great, because there needs to be a realization of the connection. There needs to be a reason why you're going to connect with somebody more generally. But I think it's unbelievably straightforward to be able to find and build and develop connections online. It's brilliant to be able to do. If it's across Twitter, I've met so many incredible people. If it's even on email, if it's the same on across social media channels, developing relationships, building connections, watching lots of fantastic content, liaising with people or speaking to people afterwards saying that was great, it'd be great to have a chat or a coffee. So I more or less think the digital networking landscape is basically infinite. what you've got to actually develop are the techniques in order to best exploit in a positive way all of the different possible digital connections that you can make. And on the old school connections, look, I think it's my view on that is that ultimately a lot of people will always look externally and go, oh, he's got so many great connections. It must have been through his dad or his mum or family or whatever else it might be. And sometimes that absolutely might be the case. But a lot of the time, a lot of people only see the iceberg effect. And Matthew Syed writes about it in his brilliant books, where you only see the positive little parts of when things have gone well, or people have got great networks, or they're doing great work and great things are happening. But what they don't see, which I mentioned earlier, is the hundreds and thousands of hours sometimes of work that's been taken in lots of different ways to invest in relationships, to build knowledge, to develop processes, all the things we'll talk about this week, hopefully, which enable you to get and progress and continue to develop your skills and your network more in the long term. Question from Mark. I'm looking to qualify as a solicitor, but my main problem is getting through the application process, especially interviews and applications. Any useful tips for either of those? Not a straightforward thing at all. I remember those days as well. All I would say, at least very simply on application process, is it is so competitive generally, and I'm sure a lot of people will know from doing loads of these processes, is that the application form needs to be perfect, absolutely perfect, not one spelling mistake, not one grammatical error, because that will separate you from the crowd immediately, and that might be the reason why you don't even get an interview or a second stage application. I also think on the interview process, it's like anything, it's very difficult to be excellent straight away. You need a lot of practice. And you need to be able to be asked tough questions and receive tough feedback from people as well. So on that respect, I'd always say it's practice, practice, practice. It's not expecting you to be perfect straight away, but ultimately it's trying to demonstrate that you know what you're talking about, that you can answer difficult questions, and that you've got the personality traits that people want when you're going through that application process. But everybody is different, and it's very difficult to keep asking for feedback and maybe bland comments coming back on that feedback. But ultimately, it's, I think, applications, real attention to detail. And I think on the interviews, it is preparation is absolutely key, and practice of preparation of your own interview voice. It's very difficult to get across your own personality without lots and lots of interview practice, in my experience. Sinir, have you heard of corporate lawyers who have made a transition to sports law? Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of corporate lawyers that in Sheridan's, for example, that work in sports law and sport across. I mean, I almost see it the other way around, is that I don't think, for whatever it's worth, that there is a thing called sports law. I think it is, lawyers that work in commercial contracts or disputes or regulations that apply their skill set to sport and the sports industry. And in the same way as if there's a corporate deal, if it's a player making investment, if it's a club being bought or sold, it's all the core skills that you require as a corporate lawyer mixed with that particular sports element too. Lots of questions here, so I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. Yeah, Bart made a good point, which is bringing value to people you want to be like or work with is key. So very briefly, yeah, Bart is my right-hand man with everything, basically. So he's my social media guru, and he helps me with all of my digital editing. And I'll maybe tell that story about how Bart and I met on another occasion. We've got one from NH. In relation to consuming content, especially in relation to player representation and also up-to-date regulations, what sites and books would you recommend? Yes, I'd recommend three things, three sites. I think the first is there's a great website called lawinsport.com. Law in Sport, I'd really recommend that. It's got brilliant sports and football regulatory and law articles. The second is from a good friend and colleague who's written a brilliant book called How to Become a Football Agent. It's great stuff on player representation. And if I can just blow my own trumpet a tiny bit, I'd also say that Done Deal is the book I wrote a while back, talking about lots of different football and sports issues. Hopefully, will be of use too. Okay, let's keep going down. Praketh. Oh, no question, just lots of love, thank you. Tijana, since you're busy, what would be a perfect message after which you would respond? Well, the thing is, the truth is I try and respond to quite a lot of messages if I can, generally, but my view is that what everybody needs to do if they want to get into the industry and think about connecting with busy people generally in any industry, sport obviously being one, is to reverse the narrative. Don't think about what the person you're emailing, can do for you. Think about what you can do for them. And that's a very, very difficult thing to think about, actually, because you've got to think very specifically about what they do, what they need, and how you can help them. And once you do that, you change the narrative. You're not asking for work experience. You're not asking for a job. You're not asking for a half-an-hour phone call. What you actually want to do is pique the other person's interest, to say, oh, that's interesting, I haven't seen that before, or, I think it needs to be short, sharp, creative, something a little bit different is usually what sparks my interest. Mazen, can you share some of the websites, books, social media accounts that publish the most sports communication and marketing content? All I would say there, if it's of any use, I would just look on my Twitter feed of the people that I follow, and follow quite a lot of them, because I use my Twitter feed a lot of the time, actually, to be able to look at interesting content that I like to read every day. One of the guys that's amazing right now is a guy called Matthew Ball. So if you go to Matthew Ball, I'm going to just type it in now. Matthew Ball, I think it's .vc. He's doing some brilliant stuff in the sports tech game, VC field. He wrote a brilliant article on esports recently. It's real in-depth, incredible coverage, and I'd really, really recommend that. Gareth Thomas, how would you approach people you don't know on LinkedIn, especially when you've barely broken into the industry? You've got to, again, maybe I've just answered it before, you've got to think creatively. You've got to flip the narrative and think about what might be useful for them to hear from you, or what can you offer them, because you maybe are more time rich and they are more time poor. So we can talk about that in terms of building relationships, but if I give one brief example, it might be that you can write them an article on something that might be of interest to you, that you've got time to be able to research into, that might be of value to them. So find the value that you can bring to them rather than asking a favor of them. And that's usually some of my experience. Let's see what else we have. Please, how do you build your network in a place like England? Hopefully, well, there's some of the things we talked about. I'm going to talk some more of that tomorrow. Any publications, I talked about that as well. Sine, how would you go about making the first connection? I feel like the football industry is pretty closed off where I'm from, in that agents have lawyers they work with. It's so hard to break through. Yeah, it absolutely, but that's the point, really. You've got to think creatively, and there's lots of different ways to be able to approach things. It might be that you decide to put some content out yourself. It might be that you decide to start approaching people in particular ways. You've got to think creatively. You can't just keep asking favors. Can I have a call? Can I have some work experience? Can I have a job? You've got to separate yourself from 99% of the crowd. And it's not an easy thing to do, but it is possible. Cool. Message from Scott. Do you have any advice on fighting insecurities when at these events, conferences? Yes, hopefully, as I mentioned, you've just got to put your phone down in a way and go to the communal area where there'll be loads of people in a similar boat to you and just say hello. I know it's very difficult and can sometimes be a little bit daunting, but that's how you've got to do it. Very straightforward, hopefully. Adam, what if you want to build something of your own? Would you still recommend this method of building relationships, and why? I'm not quite sure what you mean building something of your own. I think the stuff I'm talking about applies to any business, anyone. Ultimately, you're wanting to build a network and relationships for whatever you want to do. If it's for me as a lawyer to build clients and build relationships, if it's to, if you are a PR and comms agency, you want to find clients who work for particular brands or particular rights holders or otherwise. So in my mind, it is always trying to build relationships with people that you can develop long-term lasting relationships with. Xander, training contracts. I'm not going to go specifically into particular legal bits, but I'm more than happy to follow up offline with you on that. Loads of questions here. We're going. Aziz, who's been the biggest influence on your sports, football, law career so far? It's a really good question there. I mean, the answer is it's probably people that aren't necessarily in sports. I've had loads of great mentors over the years at two of my previous law firms who have given me fantastic advice that's equally applicable inside and outside of sports. So let me give that some thought. It's a great question. I'll try and come back to you on that. Try and get through a few more questions before we're almost done. Sabora, hopefully I've pronounced that right. What suggestion would you give for the guys who would like to transition from corporate business development strategy team to PE, venture capital side of sports and entertainment? I'm so far out of my depth to that question, you've got no idea. But if you send me an email, I can try and connect you with the right guys a bit widely to be able to hopefully answer that question. Let's keep going. Okay, we're almost at the end. Just a couple of questions. San Sapirals, the question is, it's rather difficult to get those 2 books you'd recommend in Nigeria. Okay, what I can do is if you email me afterwards, I can get you the Audible code because I've got a few left, and then you can listen to it on Audible if you can download it. So get in touch with me afterwards on LinkedIn, however you want to do it, and I'll try and help you out. Kim, I'm about to complete my law degree and I'm trying to enter the sports law field. However, it's not really big in South Africa. How would you navigate this very small industry? So hopefully the first point is very relevant to you, which is don't worry about sports law for the short term. Worry about your skill set, complete your law degree, do whatever sector work you're doing in the particular law firm that you're working in, and then build up your knowledge in sports law, network people that are in the sports industry generally. Don't worry about getting into the sports industry in the short term. Build your skills, network, build your knowledge base, and think about that in more of the long term. I'm just going to go with one question, which is Miles, because we're almost over, quite a lot over. Is there a chance you can provide us a list of sports law related sources you regularly follow, particularly Twitter accounts? Yeah, Miles, I think just literally go to my Twitter feed, go to the people that I follow, and hopefully you can find that. So hopefully that might be of use. And the last one from Mark, what would you say is the best way of promoting your own content? I write a blog and also for other websites and would like to grow that if possible. The short one I'd say there is try and link into other people's networks. That's one of the best ways that I did that originally, which is write on other people's blogs, write on other people's sites, go on other people's podcasts, network in particular ways, and introduce yourself to a network wider than your own. So we've got football CFB there. So quick question there. In terms of networking, are there any events coming up? I think it's actually a really good point. And I really like that one. Maybe we can think about doing an actual virtual networking event and that everybody can join. And maybe we'll try and do that at some point soon. I think that's a great idea, Callum. So let me think about that too. Well, we're way over, and that's ultimately because you've had some great questions. Before I do, and if anyone is new to the YouTube course I do, I tend to just give an extra couple of minutes just talking about a book that I think is really valuable. And for those, a lot of you guys were already at my previous course and watching in, but this is, without doubt, I think, one of the most important books I've ever read in terms of networking and knowledge base and dealing with people. How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I'd really, really, really recommend reading that, especially when you've got some more downtime. So That's my first recommendation for the week. I'll go through some other books as well in due course. But hopefully you've enjoyed the first day. Tomorrow we're going to talk about actually mapping out your network, start visualizing the relationships you have, and then after that, being able to develop and maintain those relationships by constantly renewing them. So hopefully that's been a good first day. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you for all the questions. It's been awesome. I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow at the same time. Thanks, and see you tomorrow.